Olga from Minerva. Today I'm bringing you a sew-along for the Butterick 6018 sewing pattern. This is part of their Butterick retro range and it's originally from 1952. It is this beautiful dress that I'm wearing here. The dress consists of a fitted bodice, decorative buttons, a raised waist, a fitted and flared skirt with princess seams, a very typical side zipper for the 50s, and also short sleeves. There's two raised neck variations, view A with the V-neck and the fold back lapels, and view B with a more rounded neckline. View A also includes shaped cuffs at the sleeves. I think this pattern is a perfect example of early 50s fashion, especially view A with the shaped, pointed lapel, the pointed cuffs on the sleeves. It has a lot of pizzazz, a lot of that like early 50s glamour. The raised waist and princess seams actually really add to that Dior New Look silhouette where you have more volume at the shoulder and more volume at the hip to create the illusion of a more slender waist. Although this pattern only features two views, I feel like it's actually really versatile. As we can see in the front of the envelope, the different fabrics you choose means you get most situations covered with this pattern, from everyday wear to a cocktail party. We're actually going to be making view A today, as you can tell from my beautiful neckline. This pattern is actually labeled medium or intermediate difficulty. The sizing ranges from sizes 6 to 22, but make sure that you're picking the sizing that you need when you are purchasing the pattern. The fabrics suggested for this pattern are any light to medium weight woven fabrics, namely broadcloth, linen, piqué, and taffeta. So let me show you the fabrics that I used to make up this version. For the main fabric, I chose our Minerva Core range two-tone shot taffeta in jade green, although the color range for this fabric is really big, so definitely check it out. This taffeta is composed of 55% nylon and 45% polyester, and it's a woven non-stretched fabric with a width of 150 centimeters or 59.1 inches. Plus, it can be machine washed at 40 degrees Celsius. If you've never worked with taffeta or are a little bit intimidated by it, I wanted to share some more information on it and also give you some tips for how to work with it. So taffeta is a light medium fabric with a shimmery finish that makes it really popular for any kind of occasion wear. It's a very crisp fabric. It has an almost crunchy texture, but it also is quite thin and slippery, kind of like a lining fabric. This crispness means that it holds its shape really well in more structured or full looks. It actually was extremely popular in the 50s, both as a lining fabric and as a fashion fabric, and it was really widely used to give the big skirts a lot of structure and to help them stand out. It's also very opaque, which means that it's perfect to use under any kind of lace material or any kind of sheer fabrics that need lining and structure underneath them. But as taffeta can be quite slippery, it may actually pucker at the seam lines when you're stitching it. I would advise you to use something called taut sewing, and this is where you kind of pull or hold the fabric taut while you're stitching it, and by creating this kind of tension between the 2 points, it actually means that there's neutral tension at the point where you're sewing, and that will help you avoid the puckers. It also helps the slipperiness of the fabric a little bit too. I would also suggest that you use a brand new sewing needle, probably size 70 or 80. I used a size 70, but 80 is fine too. This will just mean that you can avoid any mistakes or any kind of problems that you may run into when you're using a blunt needle. Also, taffeta is definitely a measure twice, sew once kind of a fabric. The stitching holes will actually show if you unpick them. Make sure you're keeping that in mind while you're working with it. I know that sounds like a lot, but with these suggestions and a little bit of patience and practice, you'll find that taffeta is actually a really fun fabric to work with, and it really will elevate all of your sewing. For interfacing, I used the Violin Vliezolene medium iron-on interfacing in white. We're going to be interfacing the bodice front as well as the front and back neck facing and half of our sleeve cuffs. For the side zip, I went with a concealed and visible closed end zip in jade green. These measure 40 centimeters or 15 3/4 inches. For the decorative buttons, we're going to be doing fabric covered buttons, for which we'll need this hemline cover button tool. Then we'll need the actual buttons to cover, which need to be 16 centimeters or 11-inch half ball shank buttons. For thread, we'll use the Gutermann Sew All polyester sewing thread in the color 402, or you can use the thread matching service on our website if you choose a different color of fabric. As always, all of these items are going to be linked below so you have everything you need to sew along with me. And don't forget to save this video so that you can sew along at your own pace. After folding the fabric with right sides together and placing all the pattern pieces on it, we can go ahead and cut them out of the fabric. Don't forget to save some scraps and offcuts. We're going to be needing them for later. Next, it's time to transfer the markings of the pattern onto the fabric using whatever methods you prefer. I cut the notches out of the seam allowance, stitch marked the darts, and transferred the rest of the markings with tailor's tacks. We also need to cut out the interfacing pieces and apply them to their respective fabric pieces. Now for the fun part. First things first, we need to sew up the darts on the bodice fronts. We're going to pin the darts closed with right sides together, making sure that the stitch marked lines match up. When sewing, backstitch at the wide part of the dart, then leave the thread tails long at the tip without backstitching. We can then tie off those threads a couple of times and cut off the excess, and then press the darts in place with the help of a tailor's ham. We'll be pressing the bust dart down and the waist dart toward the center. Next, we're going to stay stitch the shoulder edge of the bodice fronts. This is a normal line of stitches in the seam allowance that helps prevent seams cut on the bias from stretching, as well as generally strengthening the seam. Now we can sew up the bodice fronts together at the center front seam with right sides together, ending at the large circle and making sure to backstitch at this point. The pattern doesn't specify any kind of seam finishes that we should use, so we'll have to decide for ourselves how we want to go about this. You may want to use an overlocker, that's what I did, but if historical accuracy is something that is important to you and something that you want to replicate when you're making garments from a different period, it's important to know that overlockers were not popular in the 50s. So industrial overlockers were actually invented in 1881, but obviously, most people did not have access to them. So the domestic overlocker as we know it today only came around in 1964. Truly, it didn't really become popular and something that was accessible until well into the 80s. If you're looking for historical accuracy, there's a lot of different ways you could go about this depending on how much patience, what your skills are, what you intend to do with this dress. So throughout this video, I am going to be reminding you to finish your seams, and you can just use whatever method you've chosen for this. It doesn't matter which one. I'm not going to specify one. Just so you know, I am using my serger, but you can do whatever you think is best for your situation and your skill set and what is available to you. Once we've sewn up that center front seam, we're going to finish these seams separately to make our lives easier later and press the seam allowances open. We'll also stay stitch the lower edge of the front of the bodice. The darts in the bodice back piece also need to be stitched up, so we'll repeat the same process we did for the front, except we're going to press all of the darts towards the center. Then we'll pin the bodice back to the bodice front at the shoulders with right sides together, clipping if necessary. After we stitch those seams, we can go ahead and finish them separately or together and press. Next, we can pin the side seams of the bodice together with right sides together, leaving one side open below the large circle. The pattern here specifies that we leave the left side open. This is so we can insert our zipper in this area later. It doesn't actually matter which side we insert our zipper in. You pick which side you find is best or you find is more practical for you. I'm doing the left side because I am right-handed and I find left side zippers easier, but it's up to you and what is more convenient to you. Then we can finish those seams. The regular one we're going to finish together, but the side where we're inserting the zipper, we're going to finish separately and then press them. Moving on to the facings, we're going to stitch the front neck facing sections together at the center front with right sides together, ending at the big circle marking. We can also go ahead and stay stitch the shoulder edges of the back neck facing piece. Now we'll quickly finish the unnotched edge of the front facings as well as each side of the front seams and the long edge of the back neck facing. Before we attach them, we're going to press the center front seam open on the front facing. Then we'll stitch those together along the shoulder seams, matching any symbols and clipping if necessary, and then we can finish the seams together and press. Next, it's time to attach the facings to the bodice. We're going to pin that in place and then stitch the front opening and neck edges, ending at the large circle marking. We'll go ahead and trim the seam allowances and clip the corners too, before turning the facing to the inside and pressing it in place. Before we move on, we're going to also tack down the facings at the seams to keep them from rolling to the outside and moving around. Next, we can turn the lapel edges to the outside and press them lightly to keep the desired shape. Moving on to the sleeves, we're going to ease-stitch the upper edges of the sleeves between the small circles in the seam allowances. I like to add 2 rows of basting stitches with my machine for extra security and leave the thread tails long. We'll also go ahead and start preparing the sleeve cuffs. To do this, we'll stitch each interfaced cuff piece to another interfaced piece for a total of 2 interfaced pairs, and do the same for the uninterfaced pairs. Here, we're going to be stitching the shorter edge that isn't pointed. These seams are going to be lined, so there's no need to finish them. We'll just press the seam allowances open. While our iron is hot, we'll also turn in the seam allowances on the notched edges of the uninterfaced cuffs and press that in place. Then we can trim away the pressed seam allowance to 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Next, with right sides together, we'll pin each interfaced cuff pair to an uninterfaced one and stitch around the ends and upper edge, leaving the press edges free. We can then trim away the excess and clip the corners as well. Then it's time to flip them right side out and press them neatly in place. And we must also tack the ends together at the large circle, closing the cuff. Before we attach the cuffs to the sleeve, we need to stitch the sleeve seam closed and finish it. Next, we're going to pin the right sides of the cuff, this is the interfaced side, to the wrong side of the sleeve, matching the seams and the large circle markings. We will then stitch that down, keeping the pressed edge of the cuff facing free. Before pressing the seam toward the cuff, we can trim away the seam allowance. Then, on the outside of the sleeve, we'll slip stitch the pressed edge of the cuff facing over the seam by hand, reinforcing the tack we did earlier at the large circles if necessary. When that's done, we can turn the cuffs to the outside of the sleeves along the seam and press it in place. Next, with right sides together, we're going to pin the sleeve into the armhole, placing the large circle at the shoulder seam and making sure to match all of the notches and markings. Here, you can adjust the ease to fit your sleeve in, but I pulled all of my extra fullness into the shoulder seam for an extra bit of volume to match the vibes of this dress. Carefully, we can now stitch that in place and then finish the seams and press all of the seam allowances towards the sleeve. Moving on to the skirt, we can actually do a little bit of batch sewing. With right sides together, we're going to stitch the skirt front sections together at the center front, matching the single notch, and the skirt back sections together at the center back, matching the triple notches. Don't forget to finish those seams and press them. Next, with right sides together, we can stitch the skirt side front sections to the skirt front, matching the 2 single notches, and stitch the skirt side back sections to the skirt back, matching the 1 single notch. Again, don't forget to finish the seams and press them. And finally, we can stitch the skirt back to the skirt front at the sides, matching the double notches and leaving one side open above the large circle marking to insert the zipper. This should be the same side you left open on the bodice. To finish the seams, we can finish the seams on the side of the zipper separately, like we did on the bodice, and the other side together and press them all in place. Then we can pin the skirt to the bodice with right sides together, matching the centers, the seams, and any notches or markings, and clipping the bodice if necessary. After carefully stitching that in place, we'll again finish that seam and press it toward the bodice. To prepare for the insertion of the zipper, we're going to first baste the opening edges of the dress together along the seam line between the large circles. You may do your basting by hand or by machine. Then we'll whip stitch across the upper end of the zipper tape to keep it closed. Now we can place the zipper face down on the seam allowances, centering the zipper teeth with the basted seam. We must turn the tab pull up and then baste the zipper in place by hand. Finally, on the outside, we're going to stitch along our basting through all of the thicknesses using a zipper foot and a healthy dose of patience. When that's done, we can remove the basting stitches and admire our zipper. For our finishing touches, we need to make up our fabric-covered buttons. The self-cover button packaging actually includes a template to help us cut out the fabric in each size available. I copied this onto some cardstock and cut out a few pieces from the scrap fabric I saved from earlier. It's best to cut a few extra just in case, especially if this is your first time doing this. I found the best way to get the fabric to stay put was to actually do a quick basting stitch around the circumference of the piece of fabric and then place my button inside. Then I could pull my threads and lightly secure it before placing it inside the button maker. When you're using the button maker, you'll see that there's some ridges inside the button maker, and you actually need to insert your button all the way to the end. Then you add the button back, and with this hard plastic piece, place it over the button, and we can press the back into the button. Usually there's like a soft clicking sound, but you might not get that. I didn't get that for every single button, but you just press that in really nicely, and when you pull it out, if the button back is not in, you can just try again. Just like with any new technique, it may take a little bit of practice to perfect it and to find what works for you. But once you figure out how to work it, you're gonna wanna do fabric covered buttons for all of your dresses. When you've got 7 buttons made up, we can go ahead and stitch them down at the markings just like we would any other shank buttons. Last but not least, we need to finish the hem. The pattern seemed to make this quite complicated in my opinion. I opted for doing this in a way that I find easier and that gives a more clean finish, and also still historically accurate for the period for those of you who find that important. So we're going to use bias binding to finish the hem because the bias stretches with the skirt and also shrinks to accommodate the fullness and the ease of the skirt. So it actually gives you a much cleaner finish with absolutely no tucks. First, we'll use some of our offcuts to cut out 5cm or 2-inch strips on the bias. This is a 45-degree angle on your fabric where it is super stretchy. Then we will attach them to form a long strip. Now, I'll be using this little bias making tool, but you can do it by hand too. We want open bias, so we just need the 2 raw edges pressed into the wrong side of the fabric. Once our continuous binding is all ready to go, we need to even out the hem. I did this by following the pattern instructions and marking 5cm or 2 inches and trimming the hem to that marked line. It might be a good idea to try your dress at this point and check how long you want it. Now we can sew the continuous bias binding we made to the hem of the dress with right sides together along the fold of the bias binding. Then we turn that over to the wrong side, press it in place, and finally slip stitch the bias in place, encasing all of the raw edges. Pleased with how this came out. I think there were a few more challenging seams and techniques, especially setting in the zipper for me. I find that quite difficult to do. And yeah, I think the end result is really beautiful. It has this beautiful shimmery finish that, because it's a 2-tone taffeta, depending on how the light hits it, it has a kind of different shade, and I think that's amazing and beautiful. I love how it feels. I love the fit of this dress. It's so flattering, and honestly, I wish I had a party to go to right now so that I could wear it and show it off to all of my friends. If you do end up making this dress, I would love to see your version of it, so make sure that you're tagging us in your posts when you post them on our website. You can create a free account. You just go on our website and click the register button, and you can just create an account, and it's really easy and it's really fun to hang out with all your sewing friends, and it's a really great place to meet people from all over the world who have the same interests as you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!